Talk to us about how food has largely become poison. I read your most recent book with great interest, and I think for many people, the assumption is made that if it's in the grocery store or if it's at the corner market, it's obviously healthy. And you and I would both agree that most of the food-like substances that people are consuming nowadays are anything but real or anything that is metabolically supportive of a healthy lifestyle or a healthy body.
Right. Well, first you have to know what healthy means. And in order to know what healthy means, you have to know what health means. And I will tell you right now, healthcare don't know, and government don't know, and to be honest with you, modern medicine don't know. And I lived within that ecosystem for 40 years. I was trained to do exactly what all the other doctors were trained to do. And then I started doing research. What I realized was that the data that I was generating did not conform to the party line. And, the more data, the more I realized it. And so, in 2007, I started speaking out about what I thought was the biggest problem in nutrition, which was, to, not hide the ball, sugar. And I got a lot of pushback for obvious reasons from many different directions, including academia, but, certainly from the food industry. And, we did more research and, things continued to fall out. And what I then realized was that there was an entire treasure trove of work, of research that had been done back in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, before the original dietary guidelines for Americans. And it had been basically deep sixed. And when we realized who deep sixed it, we realized it was the food industry. Yeah. So we've been sort of living a fraud for the last 50 years. And we've watched our population get sicker and sicker and chew through more and more healthcare resources. And, it just became painfully obvious that, we needed, as a, individually and also as a society, a metabolic reset. Policy side of this, it became painfully apparent that there was this treasure trove of information that had been deep sixed, and that the food industry was basically writing its own narrative to keep us consuming. And so then I realized that I had to rewrite the book, if you will. And the point of metabolical is to state you are what they did with what you eat.
So beautifully stated. And there's so much to unpack there. I think there's such a large degree of cognitive dissonance. It makes people very uncomfortable, not just patients, but clinicians. It makes us very uncomfortable because it bucks along with, how I was trained. I trained at a big research institution myself. And certainly the information that I was given in the 1990s, both as a nurse and later as a nurse practitioner, is completely contrary to what I now know and believe. And do you think it was a byproduct of, we use the term multifactorial when we're in the medical environment? I think there are so many reasons for why we got so derailed. I think a great deal about what I have learned through Ansel Keys' work, conversations I've had with Nina Takeholtz and Gary Taubes, who've done a beautiful job, as well as you, kind of illustrating the history of how this has all evolved. But I do think a large amount of this is also exacerbated by the fact that, we as healthcare professionals are given little to no education. And I know in your book, you do a really beautiful job talking about registered dietitians. And I definitely want to touch on that as well, that they've propagated and aligned themselves largely, although I do know some evolved RDs, have aligned themselves with the processed food industry and big ag and all of these industries that benefit from keeping us in the dark, misinformed, and metabolically unhealthy.
Indeed. Ultimately, dietitians can be part of the problem or they can be part of the solution. The sad part is that the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics has chosen to be part of the problem. And the reason is because they get 90% of their operating budget from big food. For them, it's not what's in the food. That's what dietitians are trained to add up, because it's math.
Mhm.
Rather, it's what's been done to the food. That's processing. And that's something dietitians are not trained to know anything about. So dietitians basically have to understand the science. They have to understand the science of nutrition, sure. They also have to understand the science of food processing, food science, if you will. And they're not the same. A lot of dietitians, a lot of doctors think they are the same. Nutrition is what happens between the mouth and the cell. Food science is what happens between the ground and the mouth. Efforts have to be. And so that's why I spend an entire part of the book, part 4, on explaining what they did to the food to make it poison. Now, people say, well, food's not poison, food's food. Well, actually, that's not true. All right. And I'll give you, my favorite example, because it's the easiest example for me to talk about since it's my research. Okay. And that's sugar. All right. So when you talk about poison, you're talking about what? Keel over and die? Yeah, that's one kind of poison. That's an acute poison. And there are plenty of acute poisons, cyanide, ricin, sarin, VX gas, things like that. Okay, that's all true. And that's, parts per billion, keel over and die, all true. But there are also chronic poisons. They don't kill you immediately, they kill you over time. So arsenic or carbon tetrachloride or tobacco smoke. Okay. One cigarette won't kill you, but 10,000 over 10 years certainly might and will. Well, food, processed food, is in that same category. And in particular, because it carries a chronic toxin. And that chronic toxin is called sugar. So you say, wait a second, sugar, it's energy. Well, actually, it's not.
In their bodies. And so I think especially as a healthcare provider, when you can look at it from that perspective, it gives you profound pause in terms of how you want to view what is growing to be an increasingly, diseased population. I think the statistic I looked at was 88% of Americans have metabolic syndrome, have this dysregulation. That's unbelievable. You're really an outlier if you don't.
That's right. In fact, it's much more common to have metabolic dysfunction than not nowadays. There's no pill for this, because there's no pill that gets to the mitochondria and makes it work. The only thing you can do is prevent the mitochondrial dysfunction by preventing the toxin from reaching it. Well, that means cut your sugar, increase your fiber, because fiber also is important in terms of inhibiting sugar absorption early on. And it also helps feed the gut, in terms of feeding the microbiome, which has its own beneficial effects in terms of insulin suppression and immune suppression as well. So bottom line, you need to have a low sugar, high fiber diet. That's what we need. That's called real food. Unfortunately, that's not what the 10 major food conglomerates are selling. They're selling a high sugar, low fiber diet. That's called processed food. And so to come back to the very first question you asked me about what's healthy. So the FDA doesn't have a definition for healthy. The USDA doesn't have a definition for healthy. They're trying to come up with a definition for healthy. I actually, in the book, propose a definition for healthy. 6 words, 2 clauses, 6 words. Protect the liver, feed the gut. Any food that does both is healthy. Any food that does neither is poison. Any food that does one or the other, but not both, is somewhere in the middle. And so when you look at the data, the empiric data on juice, it's not as bad as soda, but it's still bad. Okay, and I can show you a zillion meta-analyses that show that juice predisposes you, causes diabetes as well.
Well, and I think that in so many ways, it's thought of as being so benign. I recall, I'm rounding with the cardiology group I work for in the hospital, sometimes the ICU and the cardiology step down units. And what were my cardiac patients being given for breakfast. It was white bread with faux butter, because God forbid you give them real butter.
Right.
And there was always juice. They had their choice of juice, and then they always had soda. And I thought to myself, what is going on that we have gotten to a point where we think that these things are beneficial for our patients? And the fiber piece is one that even myself, as I was reading your book, and I eat quite a bit of vegetables, I'm very diligent about that, non-starchy vegetables, really caused me a pause, because I believe that fiber sometimes gets a bad rap. The irony is, I was thinking about those Fiber One bars as I was reading your book, not because I consume them. I think I've only consumed one once, and it made me so gassy. It was
Right.
distressing.
Mhm.
But the point being that fiber is thought of as being, I think, in many ways a negative thing. And yet, what you're clearly delineating is how critically important it is to help protect the integrity of our digestive system and ultimately our blood sugar, our liver, and our gut health.
Right. Well, the fact is, the food industry doesn't want you to like fiber. All right. They very specifically don't, because fiber means decreased what's eating time for food. It doesn't last as long on the shelf. And so the more fiber it has, the quicker it will spoil. So it's easier to squeeze it, freeze it, lasts forever. You've turned a food into a commodity that you can sell on the commodities exchange. And so since it doesn't go bad, it's there forever. So, let the price work. So bottom line is, fiber works against the food industry's profit interests, but fiber works for our health interests. So this is a direct contradiction between what's good for us versus what's good for them. And ultimately, when it comes down to processed food, whatever's good for them is bad for you, and whatever's good for you is bad for them. This is a war, okay? The difference is that it is an asymmetric war, because you got to eat, all right? And it's also an asymmetric war because they have the information and you don't, and they're winning.
And they like to keep consumers ignorant to what is actually going on.
Exactly.
One of the things I love that you kind of alluded to and discussed in the book is the role of big pharma. And for anyone that's listening, we have largely conditioned our patient population that a symptom requires a pharmaceutical drug. And so big pharma has profited enormously off of our health. And so one of the statistics I wanted to make sure I shared with listeners, of the top 11 pharmaceutical companies, the net profits are $75 billion a year. The industry is 2/3 of the FDA's budget. There are over 1,300 lobbyists in Washington, D.C. to push their agenda. And they spend more on marketing than they do on research and development. So they do everything they can to drive our desire to ask for prescriptive medications instead of really changing the way that we fuel our bodies and live our lives. And this is incredibly distressing.
All right. So the nitrogen fertilizer, makes the corn grow. That's fine, except for one problem. Okay. It's growing in dirt rather than soil. So the soil's dead, but the corn grows. But the problem is that the nitrogen runoff creates nitric oxide, which is the worst greenhouse gas. Everybody talks about methane in the cows. Nitrous oxide is way worse. Way worse. It has 250 times the heat trapping capacity of carbon dioxide, and it lasts 114 years. So the more nitrogen fertilizer we spray, the worse our climate gets. Okay, and all of this occurred because of the change in our food system to promote and procure and to cheapen the cost of processed food. So how can you undo that? How can you unravel that? And the answer is, don't make it so cheap for the food industry to make processed food. Get rid of the food subsidy. So could we do that? And the answer is absolutely we could. People say, wait a second, that would make food more expensive. Well, the Giannini Foundation at UC Berkeley actually did this modeling exercise back in 2007. What would the price of food look like if we got rid of all food subsidies? And it turns out price of food wouldn't change, except for two items, which would go up: corn and sugar. Exactly what we would want to go up.
Mhm.
So to me, the first thing that has to be done is get rid of food subsidies. The problem is only government can do that. Problem is government doesn't want to do that. And the reason is because the processed food industry owns the government.
Out of curiosity and for the benefit of the listeners, do you know how many items are actually subsidized right now?
I'm not sure how many, but there are quite a few. I mean,
Yeah,
basically corn, wheat, soy, sugar.
yeah,
Yeah,
that's
and
what's
all of which are bad.
proliferative in the
All of which are
processed food
bad for us.
industry. Well, I think it comes down to the significant degree of cognitive dissonance that people want to believe what they want to believe, and whether it's hanging on to that calories in, we call it CICO, calories in, calories out, and that's the mentality they want to ascribe to. I know just personally, I mean, there's not one day on social media that I don't get a question about calories.
Yeah.
And having to dispel, I'm like, it's more about hormones than about calories. But
That's
people
absolutely
don't really,
about insulin.
yes.
It's all about insulin.
Yeah.
Okay. And calories have very little to do with insulin, because the thing that has the most calories is fat.
Mhm.
Okay. Generates the lowest insulin response.
Yeah.
So basically, if you're eating a processed food diet, you're not getting your omega-3s, and you're getting way too many omega-6s. And guess what? You're going to get sick from that.
Yeah, I think that they are probably the worst thing next to sugar. Sugar is the number one, but a distinctive number two, based on what I've been seeing the last several years are, soybean oil. I think Ben Bickman was saying is the number one consumed fat in the United States.
Yeah,
And
probably so, because we have a lot of soybeans, because they're a commodity.
Yep.
Yeah. So this is the problem. And we were told that these were good things. Oh, vegetable oil is good because it's not animal fat. Well, you know what? Actually, animal fat is cardiovascularly neutral. Saturated fat is not good for you. I'm not making it good for you. It's not bad for you. Okay. It's in the middle. All right. There's 7 classes of fats. Okay. And here they are in order of good to bad. All right. Omega-3s save your life. Monounsaturates, okay, generate PPR alpha in the liver, which is a fuel gauge in your liver. Number 3, polyunsaturated fatty acids. The problem with them is they easily turn into trans fats when you fry them too hot. Number 4, saturated fat, cardiovascularly neutral, but very good to fry in. Number 5, medium chain triglycerides. Now, everybody wants MCTs to work, and they can work, but only if you haven't also eaten a lot of saturated fat with it, because then your liver gets overwhelmed, and then you end up with fatty liver. Number 6, omega-6s, which again, pro-inflammatory. And finally, number 7, trans fats, which are the devil incarnate. But we know that now, and they're coming out of our food. All right, so 7 different classes of fats. They're all 9 calories per gram. Calories are the same. Okay, one will save your life, one will kill you. Okay, and everything in between. So calories are useless. Calories are worthless. Okay, it's the biochemistry of the molecule. That's called science. Dietitians learn science.